Hello everybody. In this video we are going to be comparing and analyzing the different European colonization methods and locations and reasons. And we're really going to be focusing our vision on these four nations. We have Spain, France, Great Britain or England, and the Netherlands, also known as the Dutch. So I would strongly suggest that you have your worksheet open in a different window or printed off in front of you, because this is probably going to be a longer video, because we're going to go into detail about the differences between these European nations when they were colonizing. And so the first thing that we need to kind of start with is kind of looking at our essential questions for this presentation. First, by the end of this presentation, you should be able to describe what are the similarities and differences among the Spanish, French, Dutch, and British patterns of colonization in America. So were there patterns or were there like similar methods that those nations were using, or was it different between the different nations? And then your learning target is that you're going to be able to compare and contrast the Spanish, French, Dutch, and British patterns of colonization in North America. But we need to start by defining some words that we'll be using a lot. And so the first word that we're going to define is colony. So a colony is a group of people living in a new territory but are keeping ties with a parent state or country. So basically, this would be like if the Spanish set up a colony, they would have a whole bunch of people from Spain come to a new territory and establish a colony, but they would still follow the laws of Spain. They would still have the same rights as people living in Spain. And the same would be said for people from other nations. So for the British settlers, very much the same with the British rights and laws, the French with the French rights and laws, and the same with the Dutch. So a colony is a group of people living in a new territory, but keeping ties with a parent state or country. To colonize, so if you hear the word like someone's colonizing, it's to establish a colony or to settle. One thing to think about is, as we're looking even at this last word, colonizing and colonialism oftentimes creates or is very much involved with conflict. So to colonize is to establish or to set up a colony or to settle. We've talked about this in previous videos, that when the European nations were creating their colonies, there were already societies living where they were colonizing. So instantaneously, the Europeans are causing conflict with the indigenous peoples and societies. In colonialism, that is to take control over or to control over an area or people. So to control over an area or people, it can be in a variety of different ways. It can be by military force, as we've kind of talked about, or it could be through a democratic process of elections or voting. And so colonialism can come about in different ways, but a lot of times it involves conflict. Sometimes it's ideological conflict, or the difference between ideas and beliefs and values. Sometimes it's a cultural conflict and a culture versus culture kind of at competition with the other. And then there could be a governmental, or like something through elections. So it's important to know those three different terms, because they're going to be used throughout this presentation. So we're going to begin. Let's look at this map and let's see if we can guess which of the European nations we're looking at. So this shows the European exploration and settlement into the different regions. We can see the English or the British up in this area. We can see the French with Cartier over in this area. We see the Spanish with some names that we probably are familiar with Cortez and Pizarro. We have the Portuguese with Vespucci. And then we have the Dutch with Henry Hudson. And that while he was English, he was sailing sponsored by the Dutch East India Trading Company. So it benefited both England and the Dutch. But the first nation that we're going to look at is Spain. So Spain sent explorers called conquistadors to the New World, or remember that's North or South or Central and the Caribbean Americas, to find gold, and to conquer lands. And remember, conquering means to take over a new society, oftentimes by use of the military. And so we will see this when Cortez will overcome and take over the Aztec Empire, as we've looked at in previous lessons. And we see kind of an artistic interpretation of that conflict here. We will also see, and we didn't talk a lot about Pizarro, but we will see Pizarro bring conquest and conquering down into Peru to take over the Inca. And so this is another interpretation of how that conflict happened, where we see the military conflict here, but we also see religious symbols, and we see that expansion of religion into the New World. And so gold from America increased Spain's wealth and power. Basically, because Spain had more gold, they were able to buy more resources and materials, which then made them appear more powerful. And so this is going to cause a lot of conflict within Europe and throughout the world. So the success of the Spanish colonies encouraged the other European powers to form permanent colonies in North America. One thing that's important to remember is that the Spanish, through their practice of conquest, set up some permanent colonies, but oftentimes the Spanish conquistadors were moving in through that continued movement of taking over new natural resources and societies. And so we see here the French coming down into the St. Lawrence River area and into the Great Lakes and down the Mississippi area. We have the English, everything from the current day area of Maine all the way down to Georgia. We have the Dutch that will focus primarily where Henry Hudson went up into the area of New York City today. And then we even have the Swedish coming in a little bit south of New York. And so the Spanish colonies and the success and the resources that they were bringing back to Europe will encourage other European nations to bring their forces and their explorers to North America. Now, I know that this map does show Russia, but we won't be talking about the Russian expansion within this lesson. We do see that the Spanish begin their conquest and their focus here in the Caribbean. We do see Ponce de Leon begin the exploration into Florida, and then we see Cortez into Mexico, and then we also see the expansion down into South America. So St. Augustine is the first permanent Spanish colony that was established in Florida. So we know that that's after the exploration of Ponce de Leon. And so St. Augustine is right up around here, and that will be the first permanent Spanish colony. So what I want us to do is to kind of look at this excerpt and also this artwork to kind of guess what the Spanish colonies in North America were like. And I'll read you this. This is a quote from Bartolomé de las Casas, and he says, quote, "I find it confounding to attempt to Christianize the native peoples, and then, when we have done so, to make slaves of them on our estates. In God's name, is that any way to treat Christians?" So we see de las Casas here highlighting that we see slavery very early found within the colonies. And we will see the Spanish force Native Americans and indigenous peoples into the system of slavery, along with we see conversion into Christianity. So we see different forms of conflict that are existing because of Spanish colonization. We can also look at this and to see other ways in which Spanish colonies were during this period. This shows the general population within Spanish colonies in North America. We have the European-born Spanish. So this is a group known as the Spanish Peninsulare, and this is a very, very small amount of the population in the Spanish colonies. So only 0.2%, so 0.2. Creoles were a group that it was people from Spain who had children in the Americas, and those children were known as Creoles. So Spanish citizens born in the Americas, 16%. Mestizos were when one parent was Spanish and the other parent was of an indigenous society or a Native American group. And that those people made up 22%. Then we see the indigenous population, 60%. So what we see immediately is that there are very few European-born settlers within these colonies, and there is a great amount more of the indigenous people. We also do start to see, especially after the slave trade system begins, a population of black individuals living within the Spanish colonies. So in the 1600s and the 1700s, Spain dominated Central and South Americas and the southeast and southwest regions of North America. Spain basically began their conquest and took over all of this area and even down into South America. So again, why did the Spanish colonize in America? Well, if we remember back, there were the 3 G's: gold, God, and glory. So we can see here on this exploration map, the explorations when they were looking primarily for precious metals and conquest. So the Spanish conquistadors searched for gold and silver. And if you look here, this is from 1513 to 1605. So about, what would we say? About 70 years, 90 years. And so we see that there is a lot of exploration in this area, which is going to have a lot of conflict that also comes with this. This is a map of when and where the Spanish set up missions or religious centers and churches for the conversion of Native Americans to Catholicism. So anywhere that there was red is where the Spanish set up a mission, or these religious centers of the settlements. So the King of Spain still had an incredibly strong amount of control in the Spanish colonies, and we see this because the King of Spain would send viceroys to strictly govern within the colonies. The colonists within the Spanish colonies could not vote and actually had very few freedoms. So we can kind of see a picture of this nobility, these viceroys sent by the King of Spain right here. The economy, or the ways in which people were making money and buying and selling goods within the Spanish colonies, was based upon gold and silver. It was known as bullion. We can see these old coins that were made out of gold and sometimes out of silver. And then we would also see what were known as haciendas, very, very large plantations and farms that would use what's called the encomienda system, a very unfair system where Native American workers would work to farm and grow cash crops like sugar. Sugar and sugar growth and development will be one of the main areas that Spain begins to make a lot of money from farming and agriculture. And Spain will use Native Americans to achieve this, and it very negatively impacts the Native American cultures and societies. So Spanish colonial society was strictly controlled. We kind of have already looked at this graph on the right, and we know that the viceroys, the royal governors, were basically kind of like king juniors within these settlements. They had all of the power, they were put there by the king, and they were the top of Spanish society. We had those Creoles, as we previously mentioned, were Spanish or European citizens that were born in the Americas, and they had some land and wealth within the Spanish colonies. We also had the mestizos, which was the lack of women within the conquistadors and the voyages, meant that there were intermarriages between Creoles and Native Americans, or the indigenous groups. And the children of these marriages were referred to as mestizos. So one parent was of European ancestry, and the other one was indigenous through one of the indigenous societies. And then Native Americans and African American slaves made up more than half of the colonial society. However, their freedoms and wealth were incredibly and negatively limited and denied. So a majority of those living within Spanish colonies had little to no rights whatsoever. So let's look at the French. So looking at this picture that was drawn, what do you think the French were focused on within their settlements in North America? So we can see here, this looks like a religious ceremony with different indigenous groups. And also here we see trade between the French settlers and the indigenous groups. So in the 1600s, there was a French explorer named Samuel de Champlain that he failed to find that legendary Northwest Passage through Canada, but he did create a colony in Quebec. So Quebec is up here in this area, and you can even see it referred to as New France. So France would claim this land from Canada, all the way from Canada down to New Orleans, and would control the territory along the Mississippi River. You will also see that the French will grow their control and claiming of land, even to include areas of the Missouri River as well, and even over into the Ohio River. This will come with great conflict between the French and Native Americans. So let's go back and let's ask that question about the French that we had just previously answered about the Spanish. Why did the French colonize in America? So like Spain, France and the French colonists focused on wealth, the gaining of valuable metals or materials, and also into converting Native Americans and indigenous peoples to Catholicism or the Catholic Church. The French, along with the Spanish, practiced Catholicism, or they were active within the Catholic Church. And so you can see here on the same map that we looked at before, while the red dots were missions that the Spanish had established, the yellow dots were French missions that they established in their conversion efforts within North America. So even right there, while it might not be military conflict, but we see an ideological and social conflict when we see the ideas and practices of Europe coming into North America. Most French colonists profited or made a lot of money from fur trade. So basically the capturing of different animals where their furs and their pelts could be sold for a lot of money, some small-scale farming, and for lumbering, or the cutting down of trees to be processed into wood and other materials made from wood. So the French, you can see, are focusing on different areas of making wealth. Because the French needed furs, they had the most friendly relationships with most of the local Native Americans. Rather than engage in military conflict with the Native Americans, the French started to attempt to establish relationships and trade partnerships with many of the Native American tribes. That's not to say that all of the tribes and indigenous people had good relationships with the French, but many did. So the French colonists actually had to be Catholic, and that kind of limited to how many people actually immigrated to America and lived within the French colonies. So like the Spanish colonies, the French colonial government were strictly enforced. So the colonial governments were controlled by the king that we see here, that they sent a viceroy, who kind of ruled over these colonies and these settlements, much like how the Spanish viceroys did, just like royal governors. So the king would appoint a viceroy, which would then be over this kind of like colonial government that would be in charge of governing the settlers within these colonies. So you can see the French and the Spanish both have a very strict way of living within these settlements and colonies. So let's talk about the Dutch. Now remember, the Dutch are from the Netherlands. And we see here from this photograph, it gives us a little bit of hints of what you think that Dutch priorities might have been. There's a lot of boats here. We can see a lot of homes that are established here. And so this actually gives us a hint to one of the Dutch practices that will be their focus within North America, and that being trading. And so the Dutch created a colony in present-day New York City, where New York City is today, right by Manhattan Island, was once a colony created by the Dutch. Now, be careful with how you interpret that. There were already indigenous societies and tribes living in Manhattan, and the Dutch had actually taken control of that both through trade and force. So the Dutch created a colony in present-day New York City and called it New Amsterdam. Amsterdam is a city in the Netherlands. And after it was New Amsterdam, it was renamed into the New Netherlands. So I kind of already gave you a hint on this one. And why did the Dutch colonize in America? They really wanted, and I'm going to move my video down a little bit, they wanted private investors, basically wealthy people, to pay these explorers to come over here and to set up these settlements to profit from trade. Basically, they wanted to be the ones that were bringing raw materials and goods and crops from the Americas back over to Europe. So the Dutch weren't involved in as much of colonizing and conquest like the Spanish, or even into the fur trade and going into the mainland part of North America like the French. The Dutch wanted to essentially be the transportation avenue for much of the resources from North America. Now, there's going to be a great amount of conflict that the Dutch encounter because the British are going to settle on both sides of the Dutch colonies and eventually force the Dutch settlers out. So we see, to attract settlers, the Dutch government would allow anybody to settle within the Dutch colonies. Doesn't matter what nation you are from, you are allowed to live in the Dutch colonies. Now, this is very different because we will see, especially within some of the British colonies, you had to be British citizens. We see within France, you had to be a member of the Catholic Church to live within the French colonies. So the Dutch government allowed anyone, regardless of their religion or what nation they were from, to immigrate or to come in, and granted complete political freedom to their colonists. They would allow for them to set up the colonial government. So this is a very large difference between the Spanish and the French, and how the king and tightly controlled the Spanish and the French colonies. The Dutch are going to be like, let's grant political freedom. Let the people create their own system of self-government within the colony. And so this is going to be an incredibly big contrast to the Spanish and the French, and even within the British, as we will soon see. So we see, as a result, New Netherland was one of the most free and diverse colonies in all of North America that was established by the Europeans. We will see indigenous people and native tribes trading often with the Dutch. We will see a variety of religions being practiced, and we will see an extensive amount of political freedom that exists within New Netherland and in the Dutch colony. Now, let's look at the British. So when we look at this picture about, what life within the British colonies was like, we can kind of take a couple of hints from this painting. What do you think, before I help you out, were some of the things that the British wanted to focus on within their colonies in North America? So artists do use symbols. So as we look at this kind of painting, we see different things that the British were doing both to gain wealth, but also in how they lived their life. We start from the focal point of this is obviously farming. So we have an oxen pulling this wagon that is collecting tobacco. So we will see tobacco plantations and farms found within the British colonies. We see farming as a big change, where we see with the French there was a lot of hunting and trapping and the cutting down of trees for lumbering. We will see the Spanish that are carrying on their conquest and kind of moving and taking over different cultures. We see the Dutch that are really hoping to invest in trade, and the British are going to look to establish a bit more permanence. Colonies where farming and agriculture and production of materials can exist. We also see a ship right here. The British are going to be involved in trading as well. And so we will further talk about that as we learn more throughout this course. So we can see that this is going to be very hard work, working within a farm and being involved in the trade. This picture also shows another depiction of how British colonial life looked. We have the leader of this group being a religious leader, but then we also have everyone kind of with the religious leader kind of as the focal point or the focus. And so we will see a diversity among the British colonies, whether it is a religious colony or maybe it might be a colony that is strictly focused on making money. And we'll further look at that in a later lesson. So we will have religious colonies. We will have economic or wealth-based colonies within the British settlements. And so like the Dutch, the British settled in America through what's called joint stock companies and private investors. People invested in the settlers of Jamestown. So basically, wealthy people wanted the settlers of Jamestown to go over to find a lot of gold and silver and valuable items that they had heard that the Spanish were capturing and to bring it back. And basically, the wealthy wanted to invest in these colonies so that they could gain more wealth through the natural resources and materials coming from North America. But that's the early ones. The British colonists came to America for a wide variety of reasons. First, some colonists came to America to escape poverty. So we will see a lot of people who are poor coming to the British colonies in America to try and better their life. And we will see a group that will sign contracts to get a ticket on one of these voyages over to the Americas in exchange that they would have to work for a number of years to pay off that ticket to be on that boat. And those are called indentured servants. And the big thing with indentured servants is they would promise to work for someone for a number of years, but then they would be granted their freedom. So indentured servants are not the same as slaves and would eventually gain their freedom. Some colonists within the British settlements they came over to gain wealth. There were some that came over to try and get rich, and there were some that came over to try and gain a lot of land. Some settlers within the British colonies came for religious freedom, and we will see this specifically within the Plymouth colonies, and we will see the Puritans and other separatist groups coming over to practice their religion without the pressure from the King of England or the Church of England. They will be fleeing religious persecution. So those members of the Puritan faith, you might usually when you're in elementary school and you see those British settlers that had the large black hats with what appeared like a belt buckle on the hat, those were Puritans, and so they were actually wanting to practice their religion without the persecution from members of the Church of England and from the British King. So it's important to remind us that Britain was a Protestant nation, meaning that the religions that were heavily practiced within Great Britain were not Catholic. So they were of different faiths. For instance, the Church of England, the Puritan faith, the Presbyterians, the Lutherans, the Baptists were found within Great Britain and England. And so all of those different belief systems are categorized into what is known as a Protestant nation. Finally, some settlers within the British colonies came to escape the violence during the English Civil War. There was a lot of conflict that was occurring over in Great Britain and England at this time, and there were some people that just wanted to live their life in a new area where there wasn't this English Civil War going on. However, it's important to remember that there was consistent conflict in the colonies because of all of the conflicting values and cultures and practices within the colonies and between the colonies and between the colonies and the indigenous groups. So colonial government had was heavily influenced by the British Crown, much like the Spanish and the French. But Britain developed a policy or a practice known as salutary neglect. And it would allow the colonists to create their own local laws and taxes in colonial assemblies. Basically, these groups that would create the local laws. So yes, there was still the British king. Then there was even a British governor. And this British governor, as you can see here, was chosen by the king, would watch over the trade. He would have the final say on the laws that the colonies passed. But ultimately, it was up to the people within the colonies to decide many of their local laws and taxes. Now, this is going to set up the stage for conflict between the colonists and the king. That because the king, he was honestly very happy because he was getting rich either way. Because the colonies were producing many raw materials that was causing the British king and the nation to get rich. So the British king kind of thought, well, if they make their own laws, maybe they'll be happier and they'll continue to provide raw materials which would make Great Britain and England rich. This will set the stage for conflict later that we will see that will lead to the American Revolution, when the king starts to impose taxes and more strict laws down to the colonies, where he had previously, during this period, practiced salutary neglect, or basically letting them make the rules as long as they were producing the raw materials. The royal governors were sent over by the king, but they had very little power within the colonies. So I know that this is a longer video, but what this really does is it highlights the difference of colonization between the Spanish and the French and the Dutch and the British. And it also shows different relationships within the colonies, different relationship between the colonies and the Native Americans and indigenous people. And it also sets the stage for many conflicts that are yet to come. Please go back and pause and rewind this video to find all of the information on your handout, and have a wonderful day.